Hello and welcome to another episode of Radh Diaries, where we demystify the wonders of modern science. I'm your host Kaushik Trivedi, and before we dive into our today's episode, I'd like to tell you a little story. In the rich tapestry of Greek mythology, there's the poignant story of Tithonus, a mortal prince who captured the heart of Eos, the goddess of the dawn. Eos, infatuated by his beauty and wanting to spend eternity with him, asked Zeus, the king of the gods, to grant Tithonus immortality. But in her haste, Eos made one tragic mistake. She forgot to ask for eternal youth. So while Tithonus was granted the gift of endless life, he was not spared from the relentless march of time. As the years passed, his body aged, growing weaker and more frail, while his mind remained sharp, trapped in a vessel that could no longer sustain vitality. Eos watched in despair as Tithonus became a shadow of himself, forever alive yet burdened by the cruel effects of aging, his once vibrant existence reduced to an eternity of suffering. Now, why tell this ancient tale? Because the fate of Tithonus reflects a very real and modern dilemma. What's the point of living longer if our bodies become prisons of decay? Just like Tithonus, our cells age too. Some of them stop dividing, entering a state we call cellular senescence. These so-called zombie cells don't die. Instead, they linger, contributing to inflammation, tissue damage, and the diseases of aging. Almost like those endless years of decline that Tithonus endured. But what if you could rewrite this story? What if instead of being cursed by the weight of aging cells, we could remove them and restore the body's vitality? And that's where our today's guest Robin Mansukhani steps in. Robin is the CEO of Deciduous Therapeutics, a company pioneering a revolutionary approach to combating aging by activating the immune system to remove these senescent cells. Deciduous is at the forefront of a new frontier in longevity science, offering hope for a future where we don't just live longer, but live better. Robin is no stranger to innovation or bold ideas. With over a decade of experience in driving transformative healthcare technologies, Robin has co-founded and led several healthcare and biotech companies, always with a passion for making a tangible impact on human health. Robin is also a renowned TEDx speaker, having appeared on TEDx stage to share his visionary insights into health technology and the future of aging. In today's conversation, we'll dive into how Robin's journey from venture capital to becoming a leader in biotech has shaped his mission at Deciduous. We'll explore the science behind cellular senescence, the promise of immune activation, and the groundbreaking work Robin and his team are doing to help us escape the fate of Tithonus. So without further ado, let's welcome Robin Mansukhani to the show. Welcome to Radh Diaries, Robin.
Thanks, Kaushik. Nice to be here.
So, Robin, to begin with, can you tell us a little bit about your background and walk us through your journey to founding Deciduous Therapeutics and what motivated you to focus on aging and longevity research?
Yeah, it's a good question. Background-wise, I did my early work when I left school was in venture capital. So it's kind of my first experience or exposure to starting companies. I worked at a seed stage venture fund. So we were going to universities, government labs, figuring out which science was interesting, and then writing the first check and creating companies with academic leaders. So I found that work incredibly interesting. I think over time, what I realized is instead of just vetting the idea and being part of a group that could put the first check in, I really wanted to be part of the company more so than the investor side. So I've always enjoyed the operations side a lot. I think building is a lot of fun. I think creating and getting a company off the ground to the first couple inflection points is really enriching, and it's also really impactful. And so a lot of the time, companies will never get going or not get to the first couple of valleys of death because there's not enough people who are motivated enough to, take something that's early and figure it out. So it's always been a lot of fun for me. After my venture experience, spent some time in private equity. Didn't enjoy that as much, but really
Right.
came back to my roots after a few years in doing startups. About 14 years ago, I started an Alzheimer's diagnostic imaging company. So we developed a novel way to image different proteins associated with Alzheimer's and eventually Huntington's, Parkinson's, MS, et cetera, in the brain using a diagnostic imaging contrast agents we developed. That company is now in the clinic and has done quite well to date. Um, After leading that company, I decided to really focus on aging. To your question,
Hmm.
so and really what I find interesting about the aging world is that the aging mechanisms have pleiotropic effects. So when we talk about senescence, it's
Yes.
senescence affects 40 or 50 indications. Uh, Mitochondria is another hallmark of aging. It affects tens of indications. Telomere shortening. There's these hallmarks of aging. I think
Yes.
that really the value proposition is that if you succeed in modulating them, you'll have an impact on many different diseases, often comorbidities. And so I just thought
Right.
I saw the aging therapeutic space as a place to do revolutionary work because you could have single drugs that affect multiple indications in parallel, which really doesn't exist in abundance today. So I really think longevity therapeutics and health span is what kind of the catchphrase, but I think the real value is in that these mechanisms are pleiotropic, and when you can harness them effectively, they will have multi-indication impacts, and that to me is where the
Hmm.
revolution really sits.
Right. And can you tell us a little bit about the specific innovations Deciduous is pursuing in longevity space?
Yeah, absolutely. So the claim to fame for deciduous is that we figured out how the immune system naturally regulates senescent cells. So senescent cells
Hmm.
are irreversibly damaged cells, are highly inflammatory. They're having them in an acute amount of time or short amount of time, or being short-lived is okay. The problem is when the immune system slows down, it can't keep up with the accumulation of
Right.
senescent cells. And when senescent cells accumulate, they tend to multiply. And when they
Hmm.
multiply, they drive chronic inflammation, they drive fibrosis, they exhaust stem cells. They're very inflammatory cells. So they just drive a number of different age-related pathologies. And so the idea with deciduous is very simple, that we can restore the immune function to do what it was supposed to do in the first place. And so what we figured out early in the company is that natural killer T cells, which have been an often interesting, very small group of T cells, but often overlooked or mispositioned group of T cells, it actually turns out from our data that they were relevant to clearing senescent cells directly. And so that was a big finding early in the company. And really what we based, have been working on the last couple of years is how to harness these NKT cells, how to make them active again, how to restore their function. And then most importantly, what we've shown in the last year is when we can modulate them effectively, they have a massive impact on disease very quickly and very sustainably. So we can talk more about that as we go.
Right. And help me understand, does the effectiveness of natural killer cells slow down with aging?
Yeah, it slows. It's kind of like a delicate balance that it really is really quite effective when you're young. So when you're young, you're probably not having as much injury or lifestyle challenges, and you're probably more active. Your
Hmm.
body's more resilient. But over time, you accumulate more senescent cells. And it can be part of natural aging, although it's not even the primary driving factor. A lot of it is to do with lifestyle, so diets, exercise, activity, injuries as we get older. And so what happens is, you get more senescent cells as you age due to your life experience and due to your just raw chronological age. And your NKT cells over time just can't keep up. So once the balance goes out of
Hmm.
whack, you have more senescent cells, and the NKT cells just can't keep up with removing them as quickly as you would like. And when the senescent cells don't get removed, they basically will multiply through a
Right.
paracrine function, basically through cell to cell contact. They try to amplify their inflammatory signal as a way to call the immune system. And so what happens is healthy cells become senescent just by being in the vicinity or in
Hmm.
the microenvironment, and you get these kind of accumulation of senescent cells, and then your immune system is really shorthanded, and that really is fundamentally a key driver of aging, is just accumulation of these problematic senescent cells.
Right. And while you mentioned that the approach is to leverage the natural killer cells to combat senescent cells, and
Yeah.
how do we activate these natural killer cells? If you can talk a little bit more about the science behind the mechanism of action and how do we activate them?
Yeah, it's a good point. So first, I would just specify and say these are natural killer T cells. So there,
T
there are
cells,
natural killer cells that are a little bit different than
right?
natural killer T cells. One's obviously,
Hmm.
T cells. What's nice about them is they can be specifically activated by certain drugs, and two, they can kill things directly. So these NKT cells directly kill senescent cells. The way they're activated is by, if you look at the surface of an NKT cell,
Hmm.
they have different receptors. And so what that
Right.
means is one of the receptors you can focus on if you can fit a molecule into that receptor pocket, it activates and proliferates those cells. So it's just about
Right.
knowing biology. It's about knowing chemistry. It's about mostly trial and error. But eventually we landed on a suite of molecules. These are small molecules, by the way, that can fit into that receptor pocket, and when they fit in correctly, they activate and proliferate these cells, and that drives the ability for these cells to then retake their senolytic properties.
Right. So I'm assuming if someone takes the therapy or the treatment, this the natural killer T cells would go and remove all senescent cells, or is there a limit to how many senescent cells they can remove
You
in one
know,
go?
yeah, I mean, it depends how much expansion, how much proliferation of cells you get to
Yes.
them, depends how many cells you have. Typically, in our studies, we see about a 75% reduction in senescent cells. And then, at some point, we want to talk about how you characterize a senescent cell, what may look like one versus what may not be one. So, how to measure a senescent cell isn't perfect, but there are a constellation of markers you can use to have confidence to say, based on these several markers, that you are actually removing pathological senescent cells.
Right. And after the therapy, I'm assuming again there's an accumulation of senescent cells, and again we have to use the same therapy at short intervals, or I'm not sure about the intervals, but if you can tell us how frequently one has to go through this therapy to be able to get rid of senescent cells on a
Yeah,
periodic basis.
yeah, that's a great question. So there's a couple background items first. So
Hmm.
number one, in a mouse, you can initiate senescence in a mouse very
Hmm.
quickly. So if you injure a mouse with bleomycin or with a certain physical injury, you'll get senescence, in within a week.
Right.
Um, in humans, particularly, the indications that we're focused on, metabolic disease, fibrosis, that accumulation of senescent cells takes years, if not decades. So it's
Hmm.
not a quick process. I mean, in biologically, it takes about 6 months for a cell, sorry, about 6 weeks to go for a cell to go from irreversibly damaged to actually senescent. So
Right.
that it's not quick. And then enough of them have to accumulate, overwhelm the immune system, and then you have kind of this critical amount of senescent cells you need to remove. So in humans, it's really not very frequent that you get senescent cell accumulation. They kind of just pile up over time. And so your question is, if you remove them, how
Hmm.
quickly would you expect them to come back? And so really the answer is, no one really knows to date because there aren't a lot of great senolytic therapies out there right now in the market. But typically, if you follow the biology, my estimate would be you would be taking this therapy about once a year, plus or
Right.
minus a few months. So think of it kind of like a vaccine type regimen where you are
Yes.
just sort of doing a
Flushing
cleanse.
out.
Yeah, you're
Yeah.
flushing out about once a year. But because they accumulate slowly, and your immune system is still intact after that, um, it could be even less than that. So it's a really, when I talk about in the beginning about revolutions, this is part of the value prop. You can have a single therapy that could last you, for lung fibrosis about a year before you have to go back and treat again. So that's pretty compelling.
Right, right. And I've also read some interesting articles that talk about some natural ways of eliminating senescent cells, such as
Yeah.
intermittent fasting. And I'm not sure if there is enough scientific evidence to substantiate these claims, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm a believer. I think I was doing a discussion on this yesterday. I really believe in natural remedies when you can. Even as someone who's incentivized and in the therapeutic space, I'm always a believer that if you don't need to take a pill, don't. Unless take it, of course, if you need it or if you have some kind
Right,
of difficult disease or with age. But if you don't need to, I don't think there's no reason to. Um, so yes, fasting does trigger senolysis. And really, the science behind it is that after about 12 hours after a meal, your
hmm.
body starts to go into an autophagy, right? An autophagy meaning
Yes.
the state of repair, right? So if you have a meal at 6 p.m., 6 a.m., the
Hmm.
next day your body starts to go into repair. And so what happens, what I think, just my personal opinion, I think the mistake a lot of adults make is, you wake up 6 a.m., 7 a.m., 8 a.m., you have breakfast, you have like a pastry or eggs or whatever,
Yes.
you put in calories and you only get a little bit of repair maybe. And so that's why fasting is 16, 18-hour fast every day, maybe 5 times a week,
Wow.
are super powerful because one, you'll cut your food intake, which is probably okay, a little bit, and then but also your body goes into a repair state. So that's really what you want. That's the golden time. But you gotta the first 12 hours you're just fighting back the last meal you had. So really hour 12 and onwards is the bonus round.
Right. Have you had any personal experience with intermittent fasting? Maybe.
Yeah, I've been
Yeah.
fasting
Do you
most
practice it?
days. Yeah, most days
Wow.
for the last 6 years. I actually saw some friends who had started, and
Yeah.
I couldn't help but notice that it's just a great way. I think as you get older, your metabolism slows down. And it's a great way to stay in shape without having to do too much. Actually, you have to do less.
Wow.
Think about it. So, I will tell you in the beginning, my hunger in the morning was pretty uncontrollable and difficult, but over time, I've evolved to the point where actually eating in the morning is physically uncomfortable. So it's so automatic now. I don't even think about it.
Wow. I know quite a few people who just have one meal a day and it
Yeah.
works perfectly fine for them. They
Yep.
don't have any hunger pangs and their body just get used to it. This
Yeah.
new way of living. Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes you got to be comfortable being uncomfortable. So it's not. I do the one meal a day when I travel because all the time zones
Oh wow.
get messed up. But yeah, I think it's very effective. It's not easy in the beginning, but
Hmm.
once you do it, you actually realize that you're so much less dependent upon food, and your hunger really is not should not be controlling you as much as it does day to day. So there's a lot to be learned from these things, but they're uncomfortable in
Yeah,
the beginning.
absolutely. Robin, what challenges have you faced in the aging and longevity biotech field?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. One of the big challenges in aging longevity, I think it's probably one commercial, one around
Hmm.
disease. I think there's still a perception in the field that it's too nascent, or that there's some I'd say um, charlatan work in there where people are peddling supplements that are unproven,
Yes.
but people are desperate for something that's quick and easy and cheap. Um, some of the longevity approaches are also just sort of repurposed drugs that have been around for decades, so like nothing really innovative there.
Metformin.
Yeah, I think there's been a
Yeah.
challenge in the perception of the space because of that. But I think over time, that stuff's going to get mitigated because it's not going to get funded. So I think it's just going to,
Yeah.
have a natural attrition there. The second challenge is more, where we focus, and that's around how do you pick a disease to go after, right? So if you have these mechanisms are so powerful because you can go after 10, 20, 30 different diseases.
Yes.
How do you decide which one is first? And so I think
Yeah.
that's been a challenge in the field. And I think, I'll give you the Cliff Notes answers that I think a lot of the indications that are associated with aging are really difficult to measure in terms of improvements. You get a lot of qualitative readouts, a lot of PROs or patient reported outcomes. And I think
Yeah.
those are really challenging to show quantitative, irrefutable data that they're actually working. So, for example, people think osteoarthritis, sarcopenia, frailty
Hmm.
are kind of your classical aging associated indications, but you're relying upon qualitative readouts from patients that can just change for no reason day to day.
Exactly.
And so getting a quantitative readout, I think, is really where you need to focus on your first couple indications because you want to have data that no one can refute. And so
Absolutely.
if I show you our lung fibrosis study, you'll say
Yeah.
quantitatively this is working really well. There's nothing that I'm saying. I don't need to say anything to convince you because you're just looking at numbers. And
Yeah.
numbers are, impersonal, but they're honest. And I think that's how I think about aging indications is you gotta focus on numbers and data and be quantitative
Exactly.
before you get to anything that's even remotely qualitative.
Yeah, because there are a number of conditions associated with cellular senescence. You've got liver fibrosis, you've got
Yeah,
Alzheimer's, you've got Parkinson's, and many other areas. So I think you're right. It's hard to pick one area and choose your battle.
yeah, it really it's not easy, but it's a good problem to have. So as I often say, we have a lot of champagne problems in the field.
Yeah, right. And where do you see the greatest opportunities for growth in longevity research?
Yeah, I think tying together common comorbidities, right? So for
Hmm.
example, um, most patients who have kidney disease have heart disease.
Right.
Half of the patients who have lung fibrosis have diabetes.
Hmm.
And so can you have a drug that's systemic that can treat both in parallel that you don't have to take very frequently? So just, I'm always, like I said, I'm
Yes.
always thinking about revolutions, not evolutions. Think about the way that heart disease is managed today. It's PCSK9 inhibitors. If you fail statins, it's every day. Over time, those can, really have a difficult effect on your liver and kidneys and your muscles. Um, so is there a better, safer way to do it that's more effective? And so,
Right.
I'm always thinking about, if you have a disease pathology that's the same across multiple organs, and your
Hmm.
solution to that pathology is systemic, like our approach for removing senescent cells, it will have a multi-organ impact with one
Hmm.
treatment. And I think that's where the real opportunity lies. But that's not just senescence. That's mitochondria too. So if
Yes.
lots of approaches around regulating mitochondria, or activating mitochondria in the brain, or quieting it for some indications. And so my point is that these pathologies exist in multiple tissues at once, and if your drug can hit multiple tissues at once safely, we're talking about single drugs that have multi-organ impacts, and that to me is revolutionary.
Right. And although we did briefly touch upon this aspect, but I want to come back to this. What are your thoughts on the studies that are currently going on to check the efficacy of metformin and rapamycin in aging and longevity space?
Yeah, I think there's definitely some impact. I think it's going to be a seemingly an improvement. I think that the value in these drugs is the side effects tend to be pretty tolerable. So there's not a lot. I think there's not a lot of downside, but I'd marry that and say there's also, to me, it doesn't seem to be a lot of upside either. So I just think they're fine. If that's all we have right now, what's on the market, fine. I just think we can do better. I just think if you look at the
Mm,
mechanisms of how they work, how long they've been around, in making the next generation Rapalog or metformin approach just doesn't, for me, it's not exciting, but I can understand that, if you're a patient in the here and now, that these could be incrementally helpful to you. So I can support that. But for me, when I'm trying to think about revolutions, I don't see it there.
right. And also, I've heard different sort of theories. There are people who say that if you are diabetic and if you are taking metformin, then it's naturally going to have an effect, a positive effect on your progression of your condition, your diabetes, and naturally it would lead to a longer lifespan or health span. But if someone who's not diabetic, metformin may not be as effective as it would be otherwise.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that's why I come back to, like, what's the downside? So let's say it has no positive effect, but does have a negative effect. And I think
Hmm.
with those drugs, we know that they're not going to have a profound negative effect. So I think there's a lot of downside. I just don't think that the upside is all that compelling. So here and now, fine, but that's not what we would focus on.
Right. And uh, the space where you're operating right now it can be very demanding, and there are a lot of pressures and a lot of stress,
Yeah.
especially the phase that Deciduous is going through. How what drives you to keep going, and even when things get tough? Of course, there are ups and downs every day, and
Yeah. Yeah, there absolutely are. It's been the last couple of years some of the worst I've heard, some of the worst biotech market in decades. We've seen a couple companies here go under. I have a lot of friends who've
yes.
struggled to raise capital, so it is super challenging. I just think one, I was talking about this morning.
Mhm.
Got a whole bunch of really good problems to have. We have incredible intellectual engagement with the work we do. So forget about the money and the finance for a second. The intellectual
Yes.
underpinnings of the science that we're working on, a lot of companies are working on, is super interesting.
Hmm.
I mean, so just think about it. You get to wake up and work on something that's really interesting all day, every day. Like that's a pretty cool opportunity. And money has nothing to do with that part of it. So I think that's probably the number one thing for me. I don't like, I wouldn't, when I talk about private equity, the reason I left is it just wasn't that intellectually challenging. It's just, you're kind of coordinating the flow of money if you really think about it. And why is that interesting? It's actually not, at least to me. So
Yeah.
I just think biotech, making new drugs, navigating these pathways, the unknowns of in vitro to in vivo to translation to humans, super cool challenge to be able to focus on every day. So I
Yes.
just think that's where I kind of begin and end on why it's fun and why you want to do it. But I think you know um, there's other reasons. I think the people you work with is always a motivating factor. So we're lucky to have a really great diverse group of employees and
Hmm.
scientists and execs here. So I just think like that, being around these people every day is also, it's a lot of fun to come in and engage with really smart people with a lot of ideas and figure out how to all streamline it into kind of one mission. So I think, between the people and the science, it's all gravy.
Right. And what's the most important lesson that you've learned in the biotech startup space that you'd like to share with our audience?
Yeah, I think it's kind of what I said several times before. I think you got to have, you know, revolutions are what we should all be after. So from a fundraising perspective, from a pharma perspective, from a patient um, advocacy perspective, everything. I just think you have to have big, lofty goals, and I think
Hmm.
if you try to have an evolutionary impact on medicine, it's less likely to get funded, less likely to make an impact by the time it actually gets to the market, less likely to attract good talent. So I just think revolutions are what the focus should be.
Right. How do you approach leadership, and what have been your biggest challenges as a leader?
Yeah, I mean it's not easy, and every what I think was learned the hard way is probably every person needs a different sort of leader. So not everyone subscribes to the same. So I think sometimes I have to bring out different leadership qualities depending on who I'm working with. So
Hmm.
some people respond to certain things, other people respond to different things. So you just have to know your audience, I think is the message.
Yeah.
Um, my tenets as a leader is always the first look in the mirror. So I very rarely will ever critique anyone without critiquing myself first. So I just think it's easy low hanging fruit sometimes to critique others. The hard part is to admit your own faults. So I try to do that first. I try to take my own role in responsibility these things first, and then build from there. So that's number one. And two, I think words are, always heavily influencing when they come from a leader, but I think your actions are probably more important. So I just try to focus on substance and
Yeah.
actions over anything else as a starting point. I think that's um, you know no one can ever debate your actions. Whether or not you did what you say you're going to do, or how inspirational words are. Maybe
Yes.
they're window dressing, but they're not the substance. I try to focus on the substance first.
Right. And one thing that we hear a lot about you is your hands-on approach to leadership, and you're pretty hands-on. That's what I've heard in the
Hmm.
industry. And what do you have to say about that?
I've been at board meetings before with when other CEOs are being discussed, and I've always heard that whenever it's negative, usually the response from the board is that CEO is asleep at the wheel. So
Yeah.
I try to have two hands on the wheel. I think I've learned over the years to not go in cruise control, but you know to delegate decisions
Right.
when appropriate and when fitting. I don't need to own every decision. I don't need to be part of every decision, but I need to know that it got made and that it was organized and that we acted on it. But I don't need to make all the decisions. So it's a delicate balance. You never want to feel like you're asleep at the wheel. You never want to feel like you're not doing enough. CEOs are often on the guillotine. Once every couple months, regardless. So you just want to feel like, did I do everything I could? And so sometimes it's hard to exit yourself from some of the conversations or decisions. But I think what I've learned is when you empower good people, the results will be a better culmination than um, if one person is doing everything. So, lessons learned from mistakes in the past.
Yeah. Yeah. And you said it very well. It's a very fine balance. And where do you draw a line between having a hands-on approach to uh, micromanaging or breathing down somebody's neck?
I just think it's SME, so subject matter experts, right? So if somebody
Hmm.
else knows it and they really are finely tuned and they did the work to have an opinion, then go with that. There's very few times I can't remember any times where somebody said who just knew much more about something than me, where they said we're going in this direction, and why would I dispute that if they put the work in to know that, and they know it better than me, and they 10 more years of experience on one area than I do, then
Hmm.
why get in the way? I think my thing is only just did people actually put in the work to have the opinion. And so I think oftentimes people get trapped in older dogma. So always try to challenge that.
Yes.
Are you commenting on what happened 10 years
Hmm.
ago and you're saying that's my experience, or are you commenting on what's more recent and up to date? So if I learn that they put the work in to know to bring their knowledge up to speed, then we're good. But there's a lot
Right.
of dogma in the field. And I think actually, breaking the dogma is probably where opportunity lies, right? I mean, so for example, like on
Hmm.
scientifically, TGF beta has been, the dogmatic target
Yeah.
for so many years, where people said, great target for treating a number of different diseases, but if you inhibit TGF beta, you get tissue degradation, and so all TGF beta programs kind of went away for a while.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, but then companies have come out more recently, like Pliant and other companies, found a way to thread the needle on TGF beta. So if they would have lived in the dogma of the past, those companies wouldn't be succeeding the way they are. So I
Absolutely.
just think you have to be up to speed on your knowledge, and you have to, and older dogma, I think, is sometimes where opportunities exist. So really, it's about, can you, are you willing to change your mind in the face of good evidence?
Very well said. You're spot on. And what advice would you give to someone who's just starting out in their career?
Depends what they want to do. I think, I think the reality is that being an entrepreneur is hard. It's not for
Yeah.
most people. It's probably not for 99% of people. Just to be very blunt with you. And it's not a criticism. It's just, I think it's just reality. Being an entrepreneur, I think is, you're gonna have to put a lot of yourself on the line, a lot of your financial desires on the line, or just ignore them for a while. You got to put a lot of your ability to want and handle stress will be a primary piece of it too. So I think in the end of the day, you just gotta. My advice would always be just you got to find something that really excites you. Like what do you think about when you don't have to, right? Like where does your mind go?
Yes.
Professionally, like where does it? What like failure was an option. What would you do? If
Hmm.
where does your mind naturally gravitate towards? Like what excites you? And I think so many people just stay in jobs because they're comfortable or secure, or they think they know it. They don't want to take the risk, and it's just like it's that old Drake line from everybody dies but not everybody lives. So I just feel like you got to
Yes.
do you got to do the thing that you really naturally feel an inclination towards, and no matter what it is. I think it's
Hmm.
the money will come if you're I always told myself when I was younger, be really good. If you're really good, you'll be taken care of financially one day. It's not going to be today, and there's going to be it's going to take longer than you want. But if you're really good at something, typically you're going to get compensated very well for it over time. So just be really good.
And be passionate about what you love and continue to pursue your passion. I think
Yeah.
that's true. So, Robin, what's next for you? What are you most excited about in the future?
I think a lot about putting this drug into the first patient. I think
Hmm.
I've seen that moment over and over and over again in my head. So just getting there is really what I'm focused on right now. We have a nice clinical plan developed. We have a good drug that we feel is really amazing preclinical results, and now checking off the boxes on safety, FDA, raising the next round of financing to enable that first clinical study. So rubber meets the road in the first clinical studies. We've got three
Yes.
studies that we've drawn up to get into IPF patients, first in healthies, then in patients, then sort of look at efficacy in patients. So just seeing the readouts, seeing the quantitative results of the work we've done and put so much time into. That's really where my mind is right now.
Right. And is there a timeline that you're aiming for?
Yeah, ASAP, but it takes some
Right.
time to scale up, talk to the FDA, make sure everything's kosher, and then and move forward. So within the next few years.
Yeah. You reckon next 5 years?
Should be quicker, but yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we should have solid, a good amount of clinical data in the next 5 years.
Right. That's amazing.
Yep.
And I think you've partly already answered this question, but how do you envision the next chapter of your life?
I really see my role as being somebody who can do start certain things or be part of certain things early when they're less secure and less data, less feasible. And so
Right.
one of the things that I do when I can on the side is I've always offered my help to a lot of earlier entrepreneurs who are starting out, or even academics who have, I think, great data and great ideas, but just haven't figured out how to put a company around it. And so
Hmm.
I just think being helpful to finding good science and ensuring it can see the light of day is really where I think my time is best spent, because I think there's a lot of good science that never sees the light of day because you don't have the right people on board, you don't have enough people on board, you don't have enough funding, you don't have enough, the slides maybe don't look the way they should, the story
Yes.
isn't clear, people don't understand what's going on. And so I just think I've always liked to spend my time in areas where I feel like my contribution is actually relevant and important. And I think there's a lot of early science that's super interesting, a lot of potential, but we'll never see the light of day unless it gets some outside help and encouragement and push
Hmm.
to get it to where it can be tested properly.
Right. And Robin, that brings us to the end of our today's episode, and this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. From your career journey to the cutting edge work that you're doing at Deciduous, you have given us incredible insights into how aging and longevity research is evolving and how it can fundamentally change our understanding of health span. I want to personally thank you for sharing your expertise, your experiences, and your vision for the future of longevity research with our listeners today. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show, and I'm sure our audience will take away with a new appreciation for the science behind aging and the possibilities that lie ahead. Thanks again for joining us today, Robin. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you, Kaushik, and appreciate you having me on.